Hello friends, welcome to Beyond the News here at beyondthenews.co.uk, going out on Radio Lewes. I'm your host Jim Grant. This is being recorded on the 9th of July and it'll be going out towards the middle or end of July, and we'll be taking a break over August. Coming up on today's show, we're going to have two guests. We're going to have David Mulholland. He was due to be here last session, but it just didn't happen. You know what it's like on these shows. And very valued guest, former writer for Jane's Defence Weekly, now a comedian in London. He'll be at the top of the show. Then we're going to have some news and some videos on news, including why the taxman can't be trusted by the Daily Mail with the power to raid our bank accounts. Yep, you're damn right. Smartphones and shoes are the new bomb risk, says the US. And the conspiracy to erase the truth. For centuries, the wicked have dreamt of wiping their crimes from history. Now, thanks to an idiotic ruling by European judges and Google's connivance, they're going to do, I don't know what that word means, they're going to do it in their thousands. That's by Max Hastings from the Daily Mail. And we're going to be looking at an article from RT on the history of US false flags. So, without any further ado, let's get our first guest on the go, shall we? This is David Mulholland, or at least it should be. And hello, David. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can.
How are you? You all right?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay.
I was kind of shocked before I realized that the phone had gotten knocked out of the plug.
That's all right. Do we have your time for about 20 minutes?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay then, mate. Always a pleasure to chat to you. What do you want to talk about today?
Well, I'm working on an Edinburgh show, but we were talking before, mentioning the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which under the category of bad stuff governments and companies are trying to do to people. That's pretty high up there. And there's another one. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is led by the U.S., but it includes Canada and Mexico and Peru and Chile and Malaysia and Singapore and New Zealand and Australia, Japan. It's basically totally secret negotiations that will basically make it possible for companies to sue any government who comes up with regulations that hurt their profits, like, you know, don't dump arsenic into the drinking water. And also a bunch of things on intellectual property, which will mean that there has to be an infrastructure for monitoring all internet traffic. And there's another one with the U.S. and the EU called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is the EU and the U.S. And the two of them together will cover more than 60% of global GDP.
Wow.
Yeah. And both of them include really sort of lots of enforcement mechanisms and setting up basically ways to see everything that's going through the internet. And turn essentially any internet provider into an enforcement mechanism.
Wow. David, I'm familiar roughly with all that you're talking about, and I know that it's bad, but could you just preface it by saying you used to do work for economists as well, didn't you? You're a trained economist as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I was trained as an economist, and I briefly was an economist. I was East European analyst.
I tell you what,
the U.S. Treasury Department.
I know what you're talking about, but I might just give you the floor and let you just have a good old moan and a good old warning of the British public and the American public, because it's a net radio show, of what this means to them, because I think we're completely on the same page here. So are you okay if I just say to you, David, feel free to just just tell people why we should be concerned about these things and what we can do about them? Are you okay if I just give you the floor to chat about that?
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, feel free to talk about whatever of those issues you want to have a talk about first, sir.
Okay. Just to preface for the listeners, I was trained as an economist and I was an investigative journalist for a long time. I'm a comedian now, but my background is in economics and investigative journalism. So this is sort of the sort of thing that I love finding out about. The Trans-Pacific, well, both the TPP and the TTIP will come up with a very restrictive things with internet. Basically, it means that governments are going to be reading all the emails to see if you've downloaded something dodgy or basically controlling internet traffic. And the thing that's very worrisome about the TPP is it's totally secret. There's only 3 officials from each of the countries that are allowed to even read the entire, who have access to the entire text. U.S. lawmakers only have access if they go to a specific room under supervision for limited amounts of time to read specific sections, and they're not allowed to copy anything or take notes. So basically they're allowed to come into a room, read it for an hour, and then go away and hope they remembered the language. And which is...
Are you saying the politicians that are being asked to vote on it are...
Yes.
These?
Yeah, they're going to be asked essentially to vote on an agreement that will have wide-ranging effects, will require legislation to support the agreement, but they're not being allowed to read the entire agreement, which is outrageous. And at the same time, corporations and the people, executives in corporations of places like Chevron and Halliburton and Monsanto and Walmart.
They're good people, David.
Access.
Sorry to interrupt. They're good people. All those names you mentioned are associated with wonderful things on this planet, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. You go through all of them and find the number of people they've killed, made unemployed, destroyed their environment. Yeah, I mean, those 4 companies alone, the amount of corruption those people are involved in. Halliburton is like the dirtiest company I've ever seen. Monsanto is trying to monopolize the entire world food supply, and Walmart is like a cancer.
Yeah, I mean, in your opinion, obviously. But, I mean, these are the same governments that just lost 114 files on British paedophiles, aren't they, as well? You know, these people that all claim it's all for secrecy and security. These are the people that seem to lose regularly, very regularly, very important files that seem to, could potentially do them and their friends some harm as well, these people. Yes,
well, the governments don't have that good a record. Well, the UK government doesn't have a very good record on keeping hold of information. They seem to keep leaving it on trains and stuff. The US seems to be pretty good on keeping stuff secret. They try to make everything frickin' secret, which is horrifying in what's supposed to be an open government. The thing that is really scary in both these agreements is it essentially is giving enforcement powers and giving the weight of enforcement powers over to large corporations who do not have our interests at heart.
And they haven't sworn necessary law enforcement oaths like a police officer both in Britain and in America either. No, absolutely not. They're amoral organizations whose only goal is short-term profits at the expense of everything else. And that's not good for people. Find me the last time a corporation was first and foremost going, well, what can we do that will be good for the community and the society? I've heard a few quotes from members that have attended Bilderberg, and they have talked about bringing the world into what they call a post-democratic society. It sounds like what you described with those guys being into a room, not allowed to take copies of it or anything like that, essentially not being allowed to be fully informed before they make a vote. Would you say that is a move towards a post-democratic society?
Is take it from a democracy to a corporate-run society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was this, I wish I remember the name of it. There was a science fiction show where someone came back from the future, and the future was the corporatist. The corporations were running everything. And you were supposed to, be behind this agent from the future who was trying to stop people who were trying to stop the birth of a corporate state. And I just kept thinking, I'm behind the terrorists on this one. In this TV show. I saw it on Netflix. Because corporations, at least in a democracy, it is accountable to the people, accountable to the voters, and in a rational one where there is an undue influence of money and power, you get pretty good policies. You don't get anything too outrageous because people vote them out. But if you have a corporatist society where corporations really are in charge, not just largely in charge, but truly, truly in charge, then we basically become serfs to the big corporations, and they do whatever they want to us to make short-term profits. And, hey, our health and well-being and happiness are not in their interest.
Absolutely. So this is being done and it's always the way, those things that, as you say, would transgress the laws of the traditional democracy. Like you say, people would get annoyed and they'd vote them out and stuff like that. These things are often being done in secret. We see secret courts being reintroduced to the UK system last year. There's more and more this move towards secrecy, and bad things are often done in the dark, aren't they? That's the old cliche. But what does this so we understand that these things are being done secretly, and that is a very bad thing. What do these agreements do to the people both in America, and how does it affect the citizens of Britain?
Well, the effects, one of the things that all the CMC's agreements, and like the ACTA and the SOPA, along with the TTP and the TTIP, is that they all, in the enforcement mechanisms, have secret courts that allow secret information. And that governments will have to stick to. It's basically saying the corporations get to run themselves and tell governments what to do. That's essentially what it's saying. So let's say, take for one example, you want to download stuff. Okay, fine. Well, now that's going to be totally tracked, and all your behavior is going to be tracked. And it's not going to be by the NSA, which has been collecting that data. It's going to be by corporations who are looking to make money out of it. That's not a good thing. At least it's a really bad thing when you start going, well, the NSA is way better because they're only looking for terrorism and economic espionage. It's much worse when it's corporations who get all that information and say, now that we have the government's enforcement mechanisms behind us, let's screw these people for every penny we can get out of them. So, and also, I think this will have a huge effect on stifling startup companies on the internet. As one thing involved. How would you like to see Asda in the UK be one of the only supermarkets that has the right to sell food?
How does that law bring that situation into effect?
Like Asda being the only company?
Yeah.
It is. I am perhaps a bit of hyperbole, but if you look at Walmart, Asda is part of Walmart. Walmart is a massive, massive organization. It thrives on getting the lowest possible supply cost to supply, screws its suppliers regularly, but it's so big that people do business with it anyway. They have made massive profits, and their business model is basically go into an area, undercut everyone, sell at a loss until you drive out all the competition, everyone goes bust, and then you hike up the prices so you're making a healthy profit on everything.
And you advertise in local newspapers, and you're one of the only companies that has the funds to do so, and that local paper then has a headline, Walmart/Asda to save and create 50 new jobs when they open a new supermarket. And that's it, isn't it? They've saved you. They've created 50 new jobs. That's how it's spun, isn't it?
Yeah, but in the process of doing, they've gotten rid of 100 jobs.
Exactly. Yeah.
And taken away, in fact, the production jobs. The Gazelles source things internationally from the lowest possible source, and even doing that, they'll screw their suppliers. So that means local jobs go. And the effect of this is really, it's to look for a really quick effect, it's not that great. But for over a longer term, what you see is a hollowing out of wealth that isn't concentrated. You basically see a greater and greater concentration of wealth in large corporations and at the very top. And you basically go to a society that would make the pre-French Revolution or French aristocrats blush with embarrassment at how huge the gap is between the wealthy and everyone else.
Let them eat GMO.
Yeah. It's, and in fact, right now, the gap in the U.S. between the very wealthy and the rest of the country is astonishing, unprecedented in history, except maybe during the time of the pharaohs. But I saw one analysis that now, not even for the pharaohs did they have that much relative power.
Yeah. That is a trend that more and more wealth is being consolidated in the 1%, and it's a trend that's not only going up but accelerating in its rate of going up. I've got two ideas that I'd like to put to you, David, because I am a capitalist. I believe that people, if they work harder, they should make more money, and I believe that they should look to expand their businesses and things like that. But I'm a compassionate capitalist, so I don't believe that the practices that Walmart practice in terms of the way they treat their suppliers is accurate, so or a nice thing to do. So here's one idea that I would put forward that I think bridges the because capitalism has some great ideas, and also communism has some great ideas. It's just that communism usually is the middle road towards fascism. So here's my idea. No executive or top working person of a company can earn more than 20 times their lowest paid employee, because that way you would still get people to strive for all their profits and they can still keep the lion's share, but it doesn't create... There'll never be such a wealth divide of more than a multiple of 20. Have I explained that correctly?
Yeah.
What do you think of that idea?
Well, Switzerland tried to do that, interestingly, and in fact it was 20 times, I believe. I think it's a very, very good idea. In fact, when the U.S. was relatively the most powerful in the world, and in fact the top rate of tax was hideously high. At one point, the U.S. top marginal tax rate got up to 91%. And I totally agree with that. I think the best economic systems that we've ever seen in the world, the most productive and most efficient, are heavily regulated capitalism. And that's where you have government regulators with real teeth who have an interest in making sure that no one distorts the system. And also, I think, I might go for a higher multiple than 20 times, but I think it should be based on a multiple, and I think there should be punitively high taxes past a certain amount of wealth. That it is bad for a society where you have essentially the aristocrats and the serfs. And what's happening is we're all being turned into serfs. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, in Britain we now more or less have less rights than a medieval peasant, because even since the council tax laws were passed, we now have to pay to live on our own land, and that's what Magna Carta was about. So that I think that's a fair argument. Absolutely, you've made a very good point. As a second idea that I would have is, you know how governments have employment and unemployment figures, and they're probably looked at from a certain point of view, aren't they? But here's another figure that they should have. Instead of having number of people in unemployment, number of people in employment, they should have number of people in their self-employment, number of people running their own small businesses. Because we're always told, the politicians always pay lip services to small businesses. Small businesses are the backbone of Great Britain, and yet we don't currently have a way of tracking them like we do the employed and self-employed and unemployed, do we?
Well, not that I'm aware of. And it is interesting if you go, as a comedian going around the country pretty frequently and seeing a lot of different high streets, you can talk all you want about the great thing about small businesses, but you go to any high street anywhere in Britain and you see the same monopoly shops.
Absolutely.
So, look at what the government actually does and what is actually happening rather than the lip service, because if you want small businesses, this isn't the way to do it.
Yeah, and it also concerns me. It can't be a coincidence that what you've just described is a reality. And you look at how that can come into place. And government, again, plays a role in it. I'll give you a real example. You know what it's like in our business, David. You finish a gig, you get back in about 1 a.m, you're hungry, you don't feel like cooking. So my diet is pretty terrible. So I go down to my local kebab shop. I always spend money in local businesses wherever I can. Now, if he stays open beyond 3 a.m, the police come knocking at his door, and I've seen them. And yet, because and he tries to apply for any license beyond then, they're told, no, nothing beyond 3 a.m. And yet, the local McDonald's was given a 24-hour license. So, corporation. Do you see the little things there? How government? Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. I used to live in Hackney, and actually, the late night takeout was fantastic there. Turkish neighborhood, Turkish food made by Turks for Turks is great. But absolutely, I mean, you look at the choices. I mean, you have the exact same experience I do. with, you're driving to a gig and the only convenient place to eat are these are chain shops. Mm. And, Ginster seems to be largely upheld by traveling comedians who are trying to find something to eat. And there's very few who actually like it. It's just there's not much choice.
So, what do we do? I've agreed with everything you've said, David. What do we do?
Well, I mean, here's the thing that I think is that if you look at it, it's still a democracy. Mm-hmm. It won't be in a generation.
Yeah.
So it's time. Now is the time to change things and quit being apathetic. There's a phrase that Lee Camp, an American comedian and activist, he keeps putting up, is that inaction is a political stance. It means a stance for the status quo.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the status quo is moving increasingly towards a economy and system of government that is not in our interest.
Yeah. And I mean, it depends how far down the rabbit hole you want to go on that, but one could say that the current education system on both sides of the Atlantic are not geared to producing members of society who want to run their own business or want to run in politics. I, for example, was never given one course on how to run a small business. All my years of education, college through to university, I was never given one course on how to start up a small business or how to run for council or MP.
That I was very fortunate when I was in my education, because I got a very good one, and it was public schools, which are not nearly as good today as they were when I went. And we had classes like on critical thinking, on taking apart advertising campaigns, and seeing the process of manipulation, and joining local government. Not starting your own business, but all those things were kind of part of the curriculum, and I think they're increasingly being lost. I mean, I kind of talk about the U.S. and the U.K. interchangeably. I've been living in the U.K. for 14 years, but I was very involved. I was a reporter working on Capitol Hill, and I got to see both sides. And then I came over here. I was a reporter, and I was in Whitehall all the time. So the similarities are enormous, and pretty much where the U.S. goes, the U.K. follows pretty quickly thereafter. So it is a bit chilling seeing some of the trends. But there's hysterically, there was a effort in Texas to remove critical thinking from the curriculum.
Well, if they want to see what that does, they should send their children to the British system. And I'm not knocking the British people or the British children, but in fact, actually, I've just written some material about this, David. I see kind of a backlash to this education system, this ruling system. I'm seeing it's in nature for children to rebel, right? Teenagers to rebel. Well, we've reached a point of such decadence and such rudeness now that the only choice that children and teenagers have to rebel is to actually be a thoroughly decent person, and that seems to be how they rebel against the norm. And I'm starting to see that. I've had some listeners to this show, very young age, very understanding of critical thinking. The reign of the chav, I think, is over. I think we've reached our trough in that, and Britain is starting to understand and value, at least in Britain, the idea of intelligence and the idea of critical thought and how important it is. And I think we've been through the worst of it. I think people are now starting to understand how to value intelligence again. But maybe that's just me. How do you feel about that statement?
I don't think that's ever been lost. It's one of the things that I've always been somewhat heartened by, is that you get these sort of broad statements, especially out of places like the Daily Mail or the Sun, saying, look at how stupid our youth are and how feckless. And then you talk to actual children and find out that, no, they're pretty smart.
Yeah.
And if they're given the chance to learn, they will. And unfortunately, it is the case that there are children learn much more from their parents, at least culturally, than they do from schools. And kids with smart parents are pretty smart generally and pretty well educated.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of smart, well educated people in this country.
Yeah, and I think that, as you say, a lot of smart, well educated people in this country and they've managed to become that person despite, not because of, their education system.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. Well, fascinating, David. Any closing comments, anything else you'd like to make? And please plug your websites and your comedy clubs.
Please come to Soho Comedy Club. We're in London, in Covent Garden and Leicester Square, and a new venue up in Angel. And also, if you're up in the Edinburgh Festival, come see my show, which is David Mulholland's Conspiracy, which is all about conspiracy theories.
Wow.
And talking about real conspiracies.
I didn't know. Oh, all right, Dave, if you've got 3 minutes, go on, give us a little preview of that. Absolutely. Go on. I want to know now. I didn't know about this, mate. Go on, tell us about your show.
I'm doing a show all about conspiracy theories. It started with the observation that people who believe in conspiracy theories tend to believe just about any conspiracy theory unless that is a real conspiracy.
Oh, I don't know.
Not to believe in the real ones.
I don't know about that, mate. I mean, a lot of people have called me a conspiracy theorist, but I don't believe in all the weird stuff. You know, when all that stuff was doing the rounds about no planes went into the towers, I was like, yeah, they did. You know, and do you know? I know there are some people that, like, you know, aliens do everything, and I saw them and they spoke to me. I know there are people out there like that, but
there's a range of of beliefs and what people believe. But I mean, I think that it's one of the things I've been thinking about is if you look at how allergies are created, is our body's immune systems don't react to everything that's foreign. What they react to is something that is causing damage, and then they look for something foreign.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, conspiracy theories, I think, are kind of like that. One of the things I've noticed about most people who believe in conspiracy theories is they're generally pretty bright and pretty socially motivated.
Mm-hmm.
And they can tell that bad stuff is happening.
Yeah.
And then they start looking around for something, and they go, oh, it must be this, like an allergy. Where someone goes, the immune system goes, yes, it's rape pollen. Well, the damage was caused by heavy metals that the immune system can't detect, but suddenly someone who's been exposed to heavy metals and which was causing damage, they suddenly become allergic to rape pollen. And and I think that's pretty much what conspiracy theories are like. And with people they recognize that something bad is happening, but they can't quite put their finger on it, so they come up with some pretty wacky ideas because we're very good at finding correlations between things. The human brain is very, very good at that. But it is, and in fact, it'll find patterns where none exist. However, it's not very good at finding causal relationships. And most people aren't taught about it, to look for causal relationships rather than just correlation. So the phrase in science is, correlation without causation.
What would be a good example of a conspiracy theory that you think is real, and what would be the good example of a conspiracy you think is completely not real?
Well, I think a conspiracy that is real is that corporations are trying to get control and circumvent governments and bend them to their will, and that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yep.
And that's happening. That's real.
Get no arguments from me
9/11 was an inside job? Yeah, no, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was a conspiracy of former U.S. and U.K. trained and U.S. funded agents known as Al-Qaeda.
Mm-hmm.
And these things I know a lot about aviation. I covered aviation as a reporter for a long time. In all these things, I've seen these videos of planes flying in, people going, that's not what would happen with a plane. No, that's exactly what would happen with a plane flying into a building.
Yeah.
And the whole thing about building number 7, I was like, oh my, they had no water after the Trade Center came down. The building was on fire, and you hear these people going very authoritatively, no steel frame structure has ever fallen down because of fire. Yeah, except for the hundreds that have, because the New York Fire Department was sitting there going, this thing is going to collapse. We can't put out the fire. And the guy who owned the building said, then focus on other stuff that you can prevent.
But what about the fact that it fell full through its mass?
It fell exactly, it actually fell kind of a little bit off kilter. Also, all the videos are from the undamaged side. The other side is just a mess.
Mm-hmm.
So you get the back of the building, not the front of the building. That's what all the videos show. And in fact, it doesn't look like a controlled explosion. It looks like a building whose structure has become too weak to support its weight, and it collapses.
Well, I agreed with your first bit on that. You're saying that Al-Qaeda is run by the Western intelligence services.
Well, it was created by them.
Yeah, created.
Sort of Frankenstein's monster. It was. The U.S. has been creating its own enemies for quite some time now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's
yeah,
create
for sure.
this. Let's create, train, and fund this group to go be our proxy fighters, and then it turns around and it bites you in the ass. I mean, look what's going on in Syria right now. Ultimately, was the U.S.'s creation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And creating its own, it's which I find just an astonishing failure of foreign policy. That U.S. foreign policy has been creating its own enemies now for 30 years, 40 years.
Do you think that is an accident, or do you think that is by design to keep the military-industrial complex going?
I think it is by accident, and then I think military-industrial complex has jumped in and tried to perpetrate it, keep it going.
Mm-hmm. And
humans aren't that organized. But if they see an opportunity and they run a company that they can make money off it, they'll certainly try to make sure that it keeps going.
Well, absolutely fascinating. Check out David Mulholland at the Edinburgh Festival. The name of your show is Conspiracy, I believe. Did I get that correct?
David Mulholland's Conspiracy.
David Mulholland's Conspiracy, and you can catch David before then at, what's the name of the website again for Soho Comedy?
It's sohocomedy.com.
sohocomedy.com. David, it's been an absolute pleasure. Hope to speak to you soon. Thank you ever so much for your time. And everyone that didn't know what he was talking about SOPA and all the other things, check it out. It's really important, and it is, like David said, time to start pointing out this stuff to people. There is a very real conspiracy to move what I would call the Western world into what I would call a post-democratic society, and it's time to learn how it's done, how they do the tricks, and to speak out against it. Thank you very much for joining us, David. Cheers, mate.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Right, now, going on to that, the video I've actually got queued up is rather prophetic, considering how we ended that conversation. This is from RT, to which people will reply, RT, funded by Putin. He's not exactly a nice person, and I would say, yes, that's correct, he's not a nice person, but
And as Daniel Bush, top officials say the White House is behind the terrorism of their population and new evidence from 9/11. Coming up.
Whistleblowers leak U.S. talks with the head of Al-Qaeda. World Trade 7 is shown on Times Square. And the father of a Twin Towers victim tells us about being attacked by mainstream media.
Decades of terror against their own population blamed on extremists has actually been funded and planned by the White House. Top-level officials in the government and the CIA confirmed. A campaign known as Gladio is called by former CIA head Bill Colby a, quote, major operation. In sworn testimony, one of the conspirators confessed, you have to attack civilians, the people, women, children, far removed from any political game, so authorities can bring in a state of emergency.
I've actually covered Operation Gladio on this show a couple of years ago. Do you remember? It was the one where they were all speaking in Italian and I tried to read the subtitles and failed miserably at trying to get it, the screen before it would, the subtitles would disappear. But I got most of it. But that's Vincenzo Vinciguerra, co-conspirator, and that's this is from RT. So, yeah.
Dr. Daniel Ganser, author of NATO's Secret Armies, thanks very much indeed for coming on. So mainstream media don't report this, but it is now on the record and officially documented that decades of terror attacks against their own population are in fact organised by the CIA and the White House.
Operation Northwoods with evidence of Operation Gladio. We have the data now available. And then the people understand that this exists, but they still have a psychological moment where they have a hard time to believe that it still goes on, because it's bad news. You know, it basically means that terrorism can be manipulated. in order to move people around like sheep, really. And if you're told you're sheep and you're being moved by false flag terrorism, I mean, this is really something you don't want to hear.
Yeah, we keep finding this term strategy of tension by the White House. What does it mean?
Strategy of tension actually means that you blow up a bomb and say your enemy did it. What we do have is evidence that this strategy of tension goes on. It's not over.
Bigger than Watergate, the FBI's Dennis Sacker calls US shielding al-Qaeda leaders up to 2001 and reports veterans today still ongoing. FBI whistleblower Sybil Edmonds has exposed the, quote, innumerable regular meetings between US representatives and bin Laden's deputy, now head of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, leading up to September 2001. July 2001, FBI agents closing in on the 9/11 plotters were thrown off the case and threatened with prosecution. Then, when officers arrested Mohammed Khalifa, directly linked to America's most wanted terrorist, Ramzi Youssef, the Secretary of State himself intervened, had Khalifa immediately deported to Saudi and released.
People at the CIA were rip not even speaking in retrospect, but contemporaneous with what the intelligence community knew. Khalifa's deportation was unreal.
Dr. Kevin Barrett is the author of Questioning the War on Terror. Great to speak to you. We actually have leaders admitting these terrorists are just tools.
And that's what al-Qaeda is. It's a cat's paw for Western intelligence agencies. And we heard this from the Arab world's leading political commentator, Mohammed Hakel, who told us immediately after 9/11 that this official story of 9/11 is ridiculous. He said when he was at the highest levels of government in Europe, he was the one who was in charge of essentially infiltrating and virtually running so-called al-Qaeda. He said al-Qaeda is full of people from Saudi intelligence, from U.S. intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and of course Egyptian intelligence. It couldn't do anything on its own. British scholar Nafis Ahmad, who's one of the world's leading scholars of terrorism and one of the best, talks about an incident that happened in Turkey. I believe this was a little bit before 9/11. A high-level, supposed senior al-Qaeda commander was arrested in Turkey. And the guards at the prison, who were devout Muslims, noticed that he wasn't praying. He was asking for pork. And they said, we thought you were a radical Muslim. And he kind of laughed and said, no, this is all just a strategy of tension.
This 9/11, the world's top physicists, pilots, engineers joined victims' families to sidestep the mainstream media wall of silence. Huge billboards on Times Square and across the states confront the fact most Americans don't know a third giant tower on 9/11 wasn't even hit by a plane, yet somehow collapsed in free fall. At 5:20 p.m., World Trade 7 suddenly, neatly and symmetrically just folded like a pancake.
This is high school physics.
A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system without it being blown up.
The government version is that office fires made all 84 steel columns break at the same time. But there are other versions. John Cole's among thousands of leading independent experts with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. Great to speak to you. So who did it?
Who didn't do it is the 19 hijackers that allegedly flew the plane. It is impossible. It is impossible to melt that steel by the office fires, the jet fuel, or the collapse itself. It's a physical impossibility. It cannot be replicated experimentally. It defies the laws of physics. If you set aside your politics, you set aside your beliefs and your religion, and you use the scientific method. World Trade Center 7 is basically a classic controlled demolition where a building free falls and comes straight down into virtually its own footprint. The only explanation that explains all the evidence, the nanothermite, the iron microspheres, the high temperatures found out there, the free fall, the uniform, what I call the uniform acceleration of the towers, when those came down, there was no impact or jolt when it hit the undamaged section below. Because there was no jolt, something blew those towers out, allowing it to uniformly accelerate downward. The only thing that makes any sense at all from a scientific perspective is that those towers were blown up.
John made a mockery of mainstream sites Nat Geo and Pop Mechanics, who've desperately tried, for instance, to show 175 pounds of military nanothermite couldn't break the columns. John did it with just 1 pound.
Can thermite of any type burn through steel beams?
I guess it can.
Renowned librarian and researcher Elizabeth Woodworth has come in to help form the Consensus 9/11 panel, confirming it uses best practice with the most rigorous peer review. Thanks so much for joining us. There's this remarkably high consensus among experts that the government version can't be right.
We have some of the top experts in the field who've published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And yet, these scientific journals exist, like the Herrott study, but they're never covered in the media. If people knew about the research, they would find it compelling. Dr. Griffin has said that he's never heard of anybody who saw the evidence, became converted to this point of view, and then changed back.
Yeah, the panel's made government already change its story and admits Skyscraper 7's freefall.
That's right. David Chandler is an extraordinary model maker. Chandler is on the panel, and he devised a model to prove that the top floors fell with no resistance. There's only one way that can happen, and that is that all the columns, there are 84 of these columns, that they were severed at the same moment.
Dr. Graham McQueen accessed the New York Fire Department records from that day. Thanks very much for joining us. Never broadcast by mainstream media, but more than 100 witnesses have even reported the explosives bringing down the Twin Towers.
Here was this roughly 10,000 pages of extremely rich eyewitness material. And I found that there were 118 people who clearly perceived explosions. You know, we have firefighters who are used to fighting high-rise fires, who are used to encountering smoke explosions and boilers, and yet they use words like bombs. You know, they don't identify it with the things we would expect.
Floor by floor instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
Bob McIlvaine has wanted answers why the post-mortem of his son Bobby found his fatal injuries in the South Tower consistent not with fireballs, but explosives. Yet mainstream host Rachel Maddow here recently sneered he's not only a conspiracy theorist for asking questions, but also attempted to connect him to violence and Al-Qaeda.
All of these nefarious conspiracies about government plots to kill and conspire and lie about it and cover up the real truth. I mean, this stuff is as ridiculous as it has ever been, but it is as ridiculous as it is dangerous.
Bobby's father joins us. Thank you very much for speaking with us. How do you feel first losing your son and now being portrayed as the bad guy?
My son died. He died from an explosion. I can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. If I was in a courtroom, a jury cannot not accept that as proof. So that's where we have our problem. When I say, well, this was an inside job. Well, my son died from an inside job from someone putting bombs. Detonations. I would make her sit in this room and go through what I just went with you. And then I would say, now you tell me I'm a conspiracy theorist. Just shows you how awful our media is. I don't want to call her the media. She makes over $1 million and they tell her what to say. One newspaper reporter, and is from the Philadelphia area, was very upfront with me. She said, you know, Bob, she says, as a reporter, I am the problem because we will lose our jobs. If I take that, just that little bit you just said, to the editor, he will crush it. So I'm telling you right now, I can't put your story out there. The media owners will not allow them. The press would not cover it, just that, because it put a little doubt in people's minds.
Yeah, who do you blame for all this?
The people of the United States are just as much to blame because they just want to believe that we are good people, we are an exceptional country. But this is what governments do. You know, it's very Machiavellian. Now we have an endless war on terror. I know what these people in Iraq, I know what these people in Syria, I know what these people in Libya, Afghanistan we're going through because they're all losing children. And that's what it's all about. Everybody's losing family members. And it's pure hell. So that's it, Daniel.
Tomorrow, Congress votes to bomb Syria, the latest war of the post-9/11 era. The US would now officially be Al-Qaeda's air force, notes former Congressman Kucinich. But America's had enough. 9 in 10 oppose this invasion, the most unpopular in history. Regarding 9/11, a massive 84% now say the government's lying. We now have the precedents documented that governments prepared to commit supreme crimes against its population. Exactly what happened on 9/11 can be argued by both so-called conspiracy theorists and the authorities. What's beyond dispute is on the 11th of September, the world will join to mourn the almost 3,000 innocent people who lost their lives. This is The Truth Seeker.
So, and now we are... smartphones and shoes are the new bomb risk, says US. Security officials order extra airport checks on high-tech planes and shoes amid fears Al-Qaeda plans to target a US-bound plane with a stealth bomb. Is that the good Al-Qaeda that we fund in Syria and Libya? Or is that the bad Al-Qaeda that we also created to fight the Mujahideen? When I say we, I say the Western intelligence services. Is that the one that the Daily Mail described as Benghazi wouldn't have happened if the US hadn't switched sides on terror and joined Al-Qaeda? It's getting a little bit farcical now, friends. It really is. It really is. So that was an article from The Telegraph on the 4th of July 2014. And now, let us see if we can get our second guest of the day. Let's get on a lady called Sunny, who's going to be telling us about what she does with organic food. And she grows organic food, and she's going to tell us how to do it and why it's important to do it.
Hello.
Hello, Sunny. You're live on the air. This is Jim Grant at Beyond the News. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Jim.
So we've met once and we spoke, and you're the co-founder of a group called Edible Eastbourne. Would you like to tell us about what that is?
Well, Edible Eastbourne kind of started out as something called Transition, and a bunch of us were working with Friends of the Earth, and we knew about Transition. Transition is a movement to kind of get people to hunker down to in the face of peak oil and climate change. And one of the main arms of the transition movement is food. So growing food in sustainable ways and stuff like that. And we found ourselves, as most groups do, moving towards doing food projects as a sort of an opening way to begin. I mean, every town has its own way of doing it. So, and then we sort of called it Eastbourne Community Orchards and Gardens, and there was a group in Todmorden up north who have been going for like 6-7 years, and they just started growing food, and now they've become incredible edible Todmorden, and they've got a tourist industry there, and they've got food everywhere, and they've got all kinds of projects, and they've had, massive lottery grants now, but they started out by just deciding we're fed up with the price of food, and we need to start planting stuff. And so we kind of took our model from them and decided to call ourselves Edible Eastbourne.
I like it.
And really, our remit is it's a movement, if you wish, and our remit is to encourage people to grow more food everywhere, to prepare fresh, local food. The emphasis is on local, it's on sustainability, and it's particularly on growing in a way that's resilient, which, in my view, is adopting the permaculture principles.
What are permaculture principles?
I knew you'd have to ask that.
Well, I have an idea, but my listeners may not know. But when I say idea, I might not necessarily be 100% accurate, and I doubt that I would have anywhere near the wealth of knowledge that you do.
Well, permaculture is kind of a holistic design system, if you wish, for sort of living, and it's a sort of a framework for creating sustainable growing and living situations. And basically we're talking about, when I say the word holistic, I mean that this encompasses all manner of living in it's based on the land, and that you would take a piece of land and you would design it around a house that's already built, or the best instance to build a house, and you design everything for the comfort of the people living there. But it's really, the growing system is based on nature working in harmony with each other, how things grow together well. So often a permaculture establishment or a place would include something like a food forest, which is whole heaps of perennial food, which is grown in 7 layers. And basically it all takes care of itself after a while, and it's extremely abundant. But that's not the only thing. I mean, permaculture is about, it has 12 principles, which I can't relate to right now, but the principles are really a system of design. But they have, one of the principles, for example, is make no waste. So, for example, if you had chickens on your land, then you wouldn't just let them poop, you know what I mean, and just discard it. You would actually use that to make some kind of compost tea or something like that. When you throw out your vegetables, you throw them out to the chickens, and the chickens will walk around in a food forest and get rid of bugs. And so that's just one way everything works together. And it's been going for about, I don't know, since the 70s, when this kind of crazy Australian guy decided to, in his terms, just bugger off and go and live in Tasmania in the forest. And he started exploring how nature works and decided that this was a great method to copy. So that's just basically the principles of the ethics of permaculture are care for the earth, care for human beings, and get a yield and have a lot to share.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
So, I grow potatoes in my garden reasonably successfully.
Yes.
What tips have you got for me growing my potatoes and listeners who want to grow their own food in their gardens? What general tips do you have for them?
Okay, well, first of all, I would say in general that if people are going to be growing food, I would say look at perennials. Do some research. Look at things like companion planting. Look up permaculture. Google it online. If you're, for example, going to plant food, you know, think about putting in things that are going to last. Perennial food lasts. And some of the most expensive foods in this country, in particular asparagus, for example, is something that comes up year after year after year. And it's something that can also be sold. It can be given away, but it keeps coming up, just like rhubarb does, which is another great perennial food. And then we have all those amazing berries, red currants and blackberries and white currants and, you know, all sorts of things like that. These are really extremely healthy foods, and I would suggest if people have room to grow some of those as well. Try and plant a fruit tree. And if you're planting a fruit tree, look up guilds. When you plant a fruit tree, you don't just plant it in the middle of some grass. You plant it with daffodils, and you plant it with things that fix nitrogen in the ground. Certain plants that you can use will fix nitrogen. Other things you put around the tree will actually their roots will go down deep and pull up minerals from the soil. So this is, you know, doing things in a very holistic way. I'm not an expert grower. I grow food. I've been growing in America for 4 years in a very different climate. But I know that one thing that you can do with potatoes that will really help them, protect them against blight, is to grow horseradish with them.
Grow horseradish with
yes.
horseradish. Now, forgive my ignorance. Can I eat horseradish?
Yes, horseradish is a root that is very hot, and people eat it with beef. You know, horseradish sauce with beef. You can grate the root and make a sauce out of it, and it's quite nutritious as well. But again, I'm not really great on the gardening tips as such, more on the overall general way of we just want to encourage people to grow more food everywhere. And one of the things we want to do is to encourage people to look at wasteland. We were talking with some councillors from Eastbourne, and we're talking about we wanted to try and start a food forest, or, you know, we started out with orchards, let's plant some apple trees, you know, for public access. And one of the councillors said to us, we've got this piece of land. I mean, it's not very big, and it's in a sort of, it's surrounded by 3 alleys, and it's really wasteland, and the residents there have been complaining for years, and we've spent a fortune clearing away the rubble and going back and forth all over again, and they just said, just take it. And we ended up creating a community garden. And we planted 4 fruit trees. We made some raised beds out of old recycled wood. We made a compost pile out of old pallets. We started with the ground. My friend and I did a design for it, a permaculture-style design, which took into account everything that the residents wanted, the people who lived around it. And we actually had one day where we just laid down cardboard over all the area and covered it with compost. And the reason we did that is it's called a mulch. If you want to get rid of weeds and things like that, rather than using pesticides and horrible chemicals, then the ideal way to do it is to sort of mulch the area to get rid of the weeds, and then if you have time, to grow a sort of crop that will actually put nutrient back in the soil. And one of the very important things about growing food is to build the soil. I mean, I had a neighbour who had been turning her soil for 50 years, throwing back all the leftovers from the plants into it, never using pesticides or anything, and her soil was like gold. And that's one of the problems in traditional monoculture farming, is that they till the soil, they turn the soil over, and they destroy all the sort of mycorrhizae, fungal layers underneath that do so much good to the soil. And then they just pour in chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides and chemical herbicides. And we want to try and encourage people to grow more naturally, to try and, you can grow stuff together, that actually helps. Like some plants will actually act as insectaries. They'll attract certain insects. And, I mean, for example, I used to have tomatoes in my garden in America, and they have these bugs called tomato hornworms, and they look just like a tomato leaf, and they eat all the leaves, and then the tomatoes can't survive. But if you plant the right things beside them, then it will attract these sort of predatory wasps, and the wasps actually lay their eggs in the tomato hornworm. So nature does the work for you rather than having to spray pesticides on them.
I like the sound of that. When you say putting cardboard over a weed patch and mulching, I don't know what mulching means, but I imagine if you put cardboard over a weed patch, it's not going to get much light, and so it will die off naturally. Is that what the process is?
That's right, yes. And, I mean, one of the key things about growing food successfully is to build the soil. And, one of the principles of permaculture is using small, slow solutions. And the work that we put in now in the beginning to really start to build up our soil and make it really healthy is going to do us a big favor in the long term. And when you grow like this, what you're actually doing is you're doing a bit of work in the beginning, but you're actually setting it up so that you have much less work in the future. And you have stuff that keeps coming up over and over again. And you can still plant your annual food in raised beds and stuff like that. But, we need to have some resilience here. And we need to know that, we can't depend on beans coming from Peru and asparagus coming from Kenya or wherever it comes from, So we're using up a lot of carbon footprint, all that kind of stuff. And I just personally think it's wrong that countries in South America, for example, are using their land to grow food for us, and it's being transported thousands of miles, and then they get money back for that food, not very much, and they go out and spend it on imported, processed garbage food. So, they really need to be using their land to grow food for themselves, just as we do.
Yes, and it will also help break the monopolies of the corporations as well.
Oh, my goodness me, yeah. I mean, we're in a kind of like vicious circle because ever since television came in, basically, and advertising started in the 60s in a big way, we've had the processed food industry, blurting out adverts to families, in the 50s and things like that, sort of sitting there telling them that it's wonderful to have a bird's eye dinner for one or a ready meal or whatever, and you've happy little kids sitting there with their fish fingers. And basically, they've been selling processed food to us to such a point that people are hooked. I mean, advertising and media are so powerful. I mean, they can turn the mind to the point that, we don't even know what we're doing. And people will make all kinds of excuses as to why. Oh, well, it's cheaper to buy a burger sort of thing. Why would I want to go and cook fresh vegetables? They've sold us. They've sold us a game, and they've got us hooked. And as a result of that, because of the processed food, then the pharmaceutical industry, which causes a tremendous amount of diseases like diabetes and arthritis, it just makes all those things worse. And, of course, the pharmaceutical companies want us to stay sick. They want us to stay sick so they can peddle us their drugs forever. I mean, this isn't really the remit of Edible Eastbourne as such. This is my personal remit. This is what...
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, I've got to wrap this show up now, but I'm, as you know, I record several in one go. So if you stay on the line, we'll come back effectively on next week's show, which we'll be doing about 1 minute's time, real time between you and I. So if you stay on the line, I'll wrap this show up. You can come back and talk to us on next week's show about what I'd like to hear about is your personal remit, what it is you're trying to achieve with Edible Eastbourne and how people can get involved, and also general tips on creating good soil, if you like. So, and anything else you wanted to talk about. But those three things that I'd love to pick your knowledge on. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Beyond the News at We'd like to thank Sunny for joining us. She'll be coming on next week's show, which, as you know, will be recorded in about 2 minutes' time. We'd also like to thank David Mulholland at the start of the show, and I hope you've enjoyed the articles that we've got. Coming up on next week's show will be Sunny continuing to do her talk. We're also going to be looking at some of the news on why the taxman can't be trusted with raiding our bank accounts, and we'll also have another guest welcoming to the show, Tony Marise, who's going to be talking about generally positive thinking and how to try and combat the corporatist New World Order type takeover of your everyday life. And that's what we've got coming up on next week's show. Check out the rebroadcast at beyondthenews.co.uk, and don't forget we're away in August. Thanks for joining us.